everybody please move up? And then you're like, no one's going to do that. No, it's definitely nobody's going to do that. Let's not even ask them to move towards the front of the room, because they're definitely not going to do it. But then you do it! And everybody just come, move a row, just a row. Just a row.
I just sit here, but...
Everybody come up. Look at you too. You let them move. Thank you. Appreciate that. Oh, it feels so much warmer now, right? It feels like it's too close.
Oh, my mic's on now. Hello. I'm very glad you didn't do this while I was in the bathroom 5 minutes ago. I don't know for sure. I mean, I guess you guys would know. Hi. Really glad to welcome you to this edition of the HagueTalks. Thanks for being here. I was just chatting with a friend about how cool it is that now we're all in person. This is so much nicer. There's like hugs going on in the room, and people have shapes. Like everybody's in 3D now, which is amazing. I'm Connor Sadley. I'll be our moderator for this evening. I worked at the Hague Institute for Innovation of Law and continuing to work with the Humanity Hub here in The Hague, and so I've been around and within the ecosystem. So nice to see those of you who I've worked with and talked with in the past. We're extremely happy to have you here because, as you know, the aim of the HagueTalks is to bring creative minds together to create a breeding place for new ideas and perspectives on current and relevant topics in the field of peace and justice. So today's event is organized by the HagueTalks Youth Board, which is that one, and the rest of them are hiding. There's somebody over there. The HagueTalks Youth Board is a really cool organization contributing to the HagueTalks concept as a platform for and by students and young professionals. Hear that? You're all young professionals. Me too. This isn't great. I colored this. In order to achieve this, they work on projects such as today's event, and they rely on your active participation to contribute to this dialogue and the promotion of important topics such as the role of civilians in time of war. The wars of today are often seen as different to those a half-century ago. Large battles have given way to insurgencies. Technology has allowed significant operations to be executed at the push of a button, and information technology and the way it's utilized has transformed significantly. Well, what does this mean for civilians, for the average person? They're caught in the middle, and it's often these innocents who suffer the most. But are we seeing ways in which civilians are reshaping the battlefield themselves? By resisting oppression or by avoiding atrocities? Can they be a help to defenders, or are they doomed to suffer? We're going to discuss this relevant topic today in the city of peace and justice, and we're counting on all of you to contribute to this discussion, asking questions, and being a part of it. But before I introduce our speakers and introduce the event to you, I wanted to take a moment to thank the municipality of The Hague and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for sponsoring this event, for making it possible. And of course, a big thank you to Den Haag as well for providing us with this beautiful location and the chance to see each other in 3D. So here's how the event's going to work today. First off, we have an amazing group of folks here that I'm going to introduce to you. We're going to hear, I think, three quite interesting and different perspectives on the future of warfare from our guests. Then, crucially, we're going to hear from you. You are actually all invited to sit on your own panel during this event. Well, you didn't even know you were a speaker. You're actually going to engage in some one-on-one discussions with the person sitting next to you. So now it's time to change seats if you don't like the person sitting next to you. That's not true. Nobody move. It would be very insulting if anybody says it right now. But you each have a chance to discuss with yourselves and to be a part of the discussion that we have up here. Okay? So everybody in this room is part of the event. But before we begin, I wanted to introduce the three different perspectives that we're going to have up here on the front. Directly to my right is Jan Tijmen. Jan is Senior Legal Advisor for International Humanitarian Law at the Netherlands Red Cross. He has worked for both the ICRC and the United Nations. In a protection capacity, he has been deployed to situations of armed conflict. Jan believes international humanitarian law is built on the principles of humanity. Without these rules, there's no guidance, no restrictions, and no accountability. Jan, you're very welcome. Next to Jan is Lotje Boswinkel. Lotje is a strategic analyst at the Hague Center for Security Studies. Am I correct, Lotje? Strategic studies, sorry, I have an acronym here and I didn't go over our intro. That's okay, that's totally my fault. I just got fired. Working on European security and defense issues, prior to joining HCSS, she worked as a trainee at the European Union Institute for Security Studies and as an intern in Marketing Beirut. Lotje believes the future of war is highly uncertain. Even with the ever larger availability of data and increased maturity of forecasting techniques, predicting when and where conflicts will emerge remains a daunting task. Lotje, you're very welcome. And finally, all the way to my right is Ruslana Poropetska. Ruslana is a comic book editor in UA Comics, Other Comics, and Red Room Comics Publishing, a graduate of the Ukrainian Academy of Printing, living and working in Lviv in normal times, researching the history and theory of Ukrainian comics, and is organizing exhibitions of comic artists about the war in Ukraine. Ruslana believes working with narrative art is a way to tell the world the truth and show how brave Ukrainians are. Ruslana, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining me. So let's begin with you. The first thing I would ask for you to do is think very quickly about what is the perspective that you bring into the room today. How are you feeling? Are you upset or anxious when we talk about warfare? This is not a light topic for a sunny afternoon. So what do you bring in? Are you working in the field of international law? Are you working in advocacy? Are you working in humanitarianism? Are you angry? Are you upset? Are you sad? Are you nervous? What are you hoping you're going to hear today? Those are a lot of questions. Pick one, turn to the person next to you and just say hello and try and answer one of them. The easiest one is, what are you hoping to get out of today? What are you hoping to hear? And noise.
Ja, ik moet even wat ik is om te zeggen eigenlijk. Ja, ik heb zelf geen situatie maar wat er mee te maken is ik weet niet wat dat betekent op mijn leven.
Now's the time. If you haven't said anything yet, first of all, great job. And back together, it's only the most interesting conversations that last this long. So if you're still talking, I completely forgive you. I would be too, because I love talking. But instead of me talking, we're going to hear from the fantastic experts that we have up here on stage, to the relief of you. And we're going to start with Jan. So let me just remind you where Jan comes from. Jan being the senior legal advisor for international humanitarian law at the Netherlands Red Cross. So Jan, when you think about the future of warfare, I mean, a massive topic, and I'm really curious what you think about international law, about the rules of war, and where you see the future of warfare from this perspective. Oh, and we should have a microphone somewhere, right? Could we? Yeah. Mostly this is also for the folks online. There's that nifty little phone in the middle. Why stop, with the digital events? So there's, I think, quite a lot of people joining us just watching on YouTube. So Hi YouTube.
That's fantastic. Can everyone hear me? Is this on?
Yes.
Things are great. Fantastic. Well, thanks for being here, and hello to everyone online as well. So when I was asked for this talk, I quickly had to think about whether the law is equipped to deal with future warfare. The truth is, of course, that we can't give a solid answer to that question. Time will tell. But I think that international humanitarian law, particularly, is robust enough to deal with warfare today and in the future. So the Red Cross is the guardian of international humanitarian law. Perhaps you've heard that simply because we were born out of the same ideas, we were born out of the same thinking. One of our founders witnessed a battle and said there should be an impartial humanitarian organization taking care of the wounded and sick, and here we are. On the other hand, states should agree on the neutrality of medical services in armed conflict, and that has led to the body of law that is now known as international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law does not discuss the issue of whether a war is just or not, whether the reasons for going to war were righteous or not. It simply states that there is an armed conflict now, and because there is an armed conflict, there should be rules in place. And basically, these rules can be broken down into two main categories. One is the protection, which is protection of civilians, protection of medical personnel, protection of monuments, you name it. And on the other hand, it restricts and limits, in some cases even prohibits the means and methods of warfare. So then we're discussing the types of weapons that can be used, or the techniques and tactics that can be deployed by the armed forces. So that's roughly what international humanitarian law entails. Thinking then about the future of warfare and the fact that this body of law, at least the modern variant of this body of law, is already over 150 years old, is the fact that a prisoner of war has the right to a package of tobacco and a bar of soap. Is that future-proof? Because that should be questioned if that today, in today's day and age, is still relevant. Similarly, the recruitment of people of the age of 15 years and older is allowed under international humanitarian law. So is that still relevant today, or are we talking about rules that really should be looked at again and perhaps improved in ways? There are indeed specific sets of rules. I already mentioned a few: the protection of monuments, protection of medical personnel, etc. But there's also core principles incorporated in international humanitarian law. When we're talking about core principles, we're talking about more generic approaches to situations, such as the principle of distinction, where there should always, in every form of attack, there should be always a distinction made between civilians and civilian population on the one hand, or civilian objects, and on the other hand, military and military objectives. Only the latter can be legitimately be attacked. Also, there's the principle of proportionality, where in any attack or against the effects of an attack, the principle of proportionality protects that the military advantage should be focused only with the least civilian harm possible. So these principles are just a few principles that we can extract from the Geneva Conventions and other treaties, including weapon treaties, that I do believe that are future-proof. Is that sufficient? Perhaps it's not sufficient, but the body of law is continuously evolving. So what I mean is that we see that with occurrences in the world, they're quickly followed up by new treaty law. Customary law is also developed at the same time, and that also focuses on new forms of warfare. Think about the widespread use of landmines that have eventually led to a ban on the use of landmines. Think about the concerns that there are concerning nuclear weapons. Only a couple of years ago, weapons has been adopted. So the law follows the reality in that sense. It's responsive. Is it always sufficient? No. Does it prevent violations? Does it prevent atrocities? Again, the law cannot prevent all violations from happening. But then one should also ask oneself, without that framework, without the normative framework, what do we end up having? We have war and we have chaos. There's nothing that restricts one anymore. So without that body of law, anything goes, and that is the concern. So that is the basis of international humanitarian law, that because we have the legal framework, we can hold people accountable. First, there's compliance. If compliance doesn't work, there's accountability, and accountability is on a political level, it's on a diplomatic level, and of course it's on the level of justice as well. So in these terms, international humanitarian law is very much valid today as it was back then, and the future, including evolving body of law, will be able to address issues that new technologies in the armed conflict will bring.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. I'm so glad you're here because I think the role that international law, these normative frameworks about what is and is not acceptable in conflicts, it's so central to this question on the future of warfare. I want to push back a little bit and challenge you on this idea of the normative frameworks, because I understand that normative frameworks as they exist around the prohibition of nuclear weapons, even though there's a treaty, you're still using the treaty to build the normative frameworks that these types of weapons are no longer considered acceptable. Does it worry you as you think about the future of warfare, how there's a rise in this sort of sentiment of flouting international law or regional frameworks, as we see in some parts of the EU, with the rise of Brexit, with the rise of far-right parties in Europe, or what's happening in the United States, for example, or elsewhere, that countries can flaunt this sort of international law. Flaunting this normative frameworks is immensely popular back home politically. Does that worry you about the strength of these normative frameworks in the future of warfare?
In general terms, yes, that very much is a concern. I think when we look at the development of the Geneva Conventions, just right after the Second World War, there was a tremendous support from the international community to have these conventions in place. Other treaties that I mentioned usually have followed armed conflict, where there was consistent use of chemical weapons leading up to the chemical weapons treaty, etc. So yes, that I think we live in a time where there is no such broad support. Having said that, that doesn't mean that there is no support. The fact that we now have a ban treaty prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons, even though it only is a relatively small percentage of states around the world have adopted that treaty, that does not mean that it's irrelevant. That does not mean that that it doesn't have any weight. Furthermore, if you look at the development of the law, the fact that we have a ban treaty, to use the example of the ban treaty on nuclear weapons, the fact that we have that now does not mean that before that treaty it was a legitimate means of warfare. I mentioned the principle of proportionality. We have always said, from the perspective of the Red Cross, that we do not foresee circumstances in which a nuclear weapon can be used legally without breaching the principle of proportionality. There could be no situation that you could use a nuclear weapon in that sense. So then you see that the law develops, there is a new treaty, but the principles were already in place.
I see. Okay, thanks, Jan. This question has been itching in the back of my head, and when I saw you on the agenda, I thought, I'm really interested to know what he thinks about this. Is there any pressing question from our extended panel that I can draw from for Jan? Or shall we come back to you all later as you stew these questions through your mind? Yeah, in the front row.
I suppose on the topic of the relevance of rights and of regulations on warfare, I assume you're the point that without any conflict, but it's not only where you think that there are numerous states in the years that allow certain councils and certain treaties.
Yes, I'd like to think that that doesn't make them less relevant, but similar to what we just discussed, it is a concern. International law, the weight of international law is only increases when more states have subscribed to it. At the same time, pulling out of a treaty does not mean that you don't have obligations anymore. So when you look at international law, there is treaty law, which is the main body of law, but there is also customary law. And customary law is a body of law that, if I just draw one example of IHL, International Humanitarian Law, it means that we perceive that states already follow these rules. So when we talk about the protection of medical personnel, this is very much enshrined into the Geneva Conventions and in treaty law, but we also observe that states are already doing that. So customary law already binds these states to do so. So even if a state pulls out of a treaty, it doesn't mean that it no longer has any obligations anymore in relation to a specific area of the law.
Thanks, Jan. We're a little bit behind already because I spent too long talking. So for those of you already sneaking your hand up, I'm sorry, it's completely my fault. But hang on to your questions because we're going to have a kind of whole discussion. But I want to get on to Lotje. And thanks, Jan. Lotje, as we said, working on European security and defense issues as a strategic analyst. I'm really curious to hear from you, Lotje, on sort of, I think a lot of your work is about the predictability of warfare, on trying to see what's coming and trying to understand that. That is a difficult task. So I'm curious what trends you see coming in terms of how we understand how conflict begins, how conflict forms.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And indeed, there is a very poor track record in predicting war, but still policymakers, military planners, think tank professionals such as Tijmen, they're all very interested to know the future of war because it can help us. It can help us in the best way. It can help us pinpoint where it can go wrong and possibly lead to prevention. But it also enables prioritization of planning capabilities. So it is a very important task that we're always trying to do our best at. There's various methodologies, and I won't bore you with that. But I think you can fairly say that they all start with a trend analysis. So where you look at what are the key trends that we expect to shape the world for the next 10 years or so, and how can they lead to conflict. So I'm going to walk you through 4 key trends that we have identified at HESS, and there's plenty more, there's plenty I'm not going to say, but there's limited time, so beware. Well, the first and perhaps the most obvious one in my field is the increased strategic competition between the great powers. We see increasingly assertive China, but also revisionist Russia, with their consequences for the US as a great power. Now, how may this lead to war? There's 3 ways. The first is it can lead to direct confrontation between the great powers, where they vie for influence, for access to resources, access to space, but they can also encroach on smaller states as they try to get them into their spheres of influence. The war in Ukraine is a very clear example of that. But then there's also a role to play for the smaller powers, because they may actually try to engage greater powers to back them. They may behave risky as they bet on one of the great powers to come to their rescue, or they try to play greater powers against one another, something you see India doing right now. So those are 3 ways in which great power conflict can lead to further conflict. A very closely related trend is technological, the proliferation of military and other technologies and their advancements. We see this in a number of ways. We see it in more traditional military technologies. We see that they advance, they become faster, they become more precise, and more states have access. For instance, at the end of the Cold War, only 2 powers developed land-attack cruise missiles with ranges over 500 kilometers. Today, 23 countries and 1 state actor have such missiles, while 12 produce them themselves. But then it's not just those traditional technologies. We see new ones too. We see drones, we see cyber AI. They will all shape the battlefield in new ways. And at the same time, with these technological proliferations, we see, and Tijmen also referred to that, a crumbling of the arms control architecture as we know it. The demise of INF and open skies are exemplary, but we also see a very low appetite these days for confidence building and other transparency measures. Now, how do these technological trends, how do they lead to conflict? Well, in a first way, emboldened by military clout, states may behave very riskily because they may they feel that they can make a bet at attacking, but they may also worry that an opponent with new military technologies will attack first. So it can lead to riskier behavior. This democratization, well, at the same time, this democratization of violence, of technologies, you see also at a more like intrastate level, where more and more actors have access to, for example, off-the-shelf drones, which creates tensions and spurs the risk of civil conflict too. And then finally, because our international norms and treaties are eroding, confidence is at a new low, which may lead to inadvertent escalation. Third trend I would like to highlight is increased political and social volatility, which is a very broad concept, but I want to highlight two sub-trends, which is first of all polarization. I'm going to take my notes because I have some facts that I do not want to get wrong. But we see increased polarization in societies, with technology as a very important accelerator. In 2021, 32 countries experienced a worsening of toxic polarization, which marks a 6-fold increase in 10 years' time. And worryingly, where polarization flourishes, their democracy or freedom falters. The share of the world's population living in free environments dropped from 46% in 2005 to 20% in 2021. Now, how may this lead to war? We see that countries that are that are shifting from either democracy to an autocracy or the other way around are more prone to civil war outbreak. We call, especially the newer ones, and these are called young democracies, and they're specifically prone to war outbreak. But what is more, polarization is very problematic. Also, again, a fact, since the Second World War, 53% of civil wars were fought between ethnic factions. Since the end of the Cold War, this share has increased to 75%. And especially the combination of a young democracy, so that's in between autocracy and democracy, and experiencing toxic polarization is especially risky for the outbreak of war. Again, in fact, in democracies experiencing ethnic factionalism, the outbreak is 30 times more likely. And then a fourth trend that I quickly will highlight if I have some more time is climate change. I'm not going to, well, we all know what it might lead to. It may reach without action when continuing on the current path. By 2040, we have a 1.5 increase. This may lead to rising temperatures, rising sea levels, extreme weather events. And there's three ways that there's multiple ways, but I want to highlight 3 ways in which it's going to lead to war. First of all, when climate change-induced resource scarcity increases, tensions in usually existing tensions in already fragile contexts may exacerbate, and especially when governments are not mitigating adequately, and they may actually implement mitigation measures that further add to these societal cleavages, we may see the outbreak of intrastate war. But also interstate war can occur because of climate change. For instance, when country A is managing shared resources badly, you see this very clearly today in the tensions between Sudan and Ethiopia over the water management. And then thirdly, climate change may lead to migration. I think, do I have it written down? No, but I think we currently estimate that by 2050 there might be 212 million climate change refugees. and that migration may lead to may lead to resource scarcity. It can increase tensions along all sorts of lines and cause feelings of relative deprivation. So yeah, I hope that you're still with me. These were like 4 major trends that we think that will shape the future of conflict. Clearly, it doesn't now tell us these conflicts will happen, these will not, but it does help to focus policy-making efforts, hopefully, to better understand and hopefully mitigate. Thank you.
Thanks, Lotje. I have so many questions that I have written down here. I wouldn't know where to start, but actually what I really want to do is have Ruslana and Jan weigh in on a couple of the things that you said. And so just in the interest of having everybody introduce themselves, is it okay if we go straight on to Ruslana, and then we're going to come back to you? So Ruslana, just to remind everybody, Ruslana is working on comics and on narrative art and helping the world understand conflict and truth and bravery through this narrative art. So Ruslana, what I'm really curious to learn is, first of all, taking a step back, can you explain this concept of narrative art on how you see truth and ideas being communicated visually on paper?
Okay, first of all, raising hand who read comics, please. Wow, more than expected, because sometimes people think that comics is something fun, ridiculous, and not serious, and how can we talk about comics like art, or narrative art, or something serious, and during a war, how they show our reality. But the truth is that comics are a mirror of everything what's going on now. I'm sure you know Mouse or Anne Frank Diary or other comics that are just chronicles of days before or nowadays. And actually I wanted to start talking about our comics. Yeah, because I have a few examples and I decided to show you, because how can we talk about narrative art without images? This is a part of team of our publishing house. They are drawn by our artist, and before full-scale invasion Russia in Ukraine, they all made the comics, write texts, write comics and draw it. Now they are all volunteering or became in army forces of Ukraine. It changed for us like a publishing house, because we can print, we can publish like in a normal way. We are now making more exhibition. I hope you saw it in the hall. If not, after this conversation, I call you to see. And we did it also to show something about Ukraine and this war, because image and comics as it is, it's a language of communication between people of other countries. You don't need to talk in Ukrainian, you don't need to know something about Ukraine, but you can see these images and you can see what we are talking about, because we show it, we do not talk about it. Can you show me please next one? Yes, this one. On the left side, we made a few instructions in the first day of invasion about information hygiene, like do not talk to strangers, do not pick up something from on the street, do not open the door. It's elementary things, but when you see image, you remember it, and then in another situation in real life, you will remind it to yourself that, yeah, I did not have to do this because you saw it in the image. Or like this one, it's a chronicle of one guy who was on the revolution and on the Maidan. As you know, this war started 8 years ago, not on February, because Russia invades in Donbass and in Crimea. So for us, it's a longer story that we are talking about. And we have a few comics about that period, and we also was talking in one of our comics about the Second World War, and it's important now because 2 days ago everyone reminds that we are talking that never again after Second World War, But what we see now, it's the same things what Nazis did, and it's like a circle, because we already saw it, and we already saw how many peoples died just because of war. And last one, please show me. Yeah, this poster was created in a few days of invasion, and all of them show short stories, real stories, like Mariupol Drama Theater. As you know, on March 16, Russian army destroyed it, and there was hiding a lot of people, women and kids, and now we know about 300 people that was killed that day. Now Mariupol is destroyed, like totally all city, not only theater. Or second one, it was in the beginning, on February, Russian troops killed 2 civilian people in car just because they could do it. They was driving and they was killed in the moment. And these images show how it's going on and what's going on, and maybe you don't want or you don't see a photo because it's more scarce and no one wants to see it, I think. But when we fix it on image and when we make comics, we are fixing reality in that moment and we can reflect it. It is what comics do. And also, it's an instrument of the truth, because, I see a lot of propaganda and fakes. When we list our news feed, we see a lot of things. We can check it, we just don't have time to check everything what we see. And mostly we believe in what we read. But it is the reason why not all people can call the war, and they still continue calling it like a conflict. It's not a conflict, it's a war on one country against another country. Or that fact that Ukraine was a part of Russia for years and we will figure out with ourselves, don't do nothing, they will do with everything, it's okay. No, because last 300 years Ukraine was under occupation more or less inside the Russian Empire or inside the Soviet Union or in another forms. And these little fakes, they have to create misunderstanding between people. When Ukrainian refugees come in other countries, Europeans start thinking like, who the people are, they don't speak my language, they don't know our culture, do I need them here, or I shall do nothing and it's more safe for me. It's a thought that propaganda just put in heads of people. And one of our missions is like talking about it and to tell people the truth about everything.
Thanks, Ruslana. It's fascinating hearing about your work, and I think it's really inspiring as well, seeing it come to visual life, and hearing you explain how this can create actions in people. Once they see the image, they remember it when it comes to a real-life situation. So I'm curious now, I want to ask some of you a question about what we just heard. And Jan, I want to go to you first. When you're seeing these images behind you here, and you're hearing this concept of how seeing an image, seeing something visually, like Ruslana explained about picking something up in the street, when you say the image, no, don't pick it up, that this reminds you in the real world. We're making a big leap here, but I'm curious from your perspective, what does this mean for law? What does this mean for the rules that you say? How have you seen images and visuals like this be used in reinforcing these laws to create the right types of actions that you're looking to see?
In one word, it's excellent. Part of the many tasks of the Red Cross internationally is to disseminate knowledge on the international humanitarian law, which means that everywhere around the world we're also active in training combatants and other fighters on international humanitarian law. But obviously there's language barriers. There can also we can also be training parts of the armed forces that are unable to read properly. For years, the Red Cross we have also used leaflets on international humanitarian law that were also drawn up in this sense. Not as nice as this for sure, but really just portraying images of what is not allowed and what is allowed in armed conflict. Similarly, in terms of mine action, there's also awareness campaigns that focuses on also on the civilian population to be warned about booby-trapped mines where you find a teddy bear in the street. So yes, these images are used as well. Yeah.
And do you see images used by international organizations? Is this something that you're used to seeing as well? Do you feel like sometimes we're the only people doing this, or do you see others that are now learning that visuals can be useful as well?
I think it's a good sound. It's many ways to show something, and it's nice when someone shows everything by infographics or other things because it's more useful and it's easier to understand something. So when you see something like that in my newsfeed, not from a comics artist or just in the news, it's great. And as more as we use it, it's make a simpler communication between people. So yeah, it's cool when someone uses it. We come back to the pictography like old Egypt, you know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, Lotja, I want to go to you. You made so many interesting points about these trends, and I wanted to focus in on one of them, which is polarization. And I'm curious, while we're on the topic of how to change a mind or how to communicate information that really reaches somebody, whether it's visual or not, along the lines of that trend you mentioned with polarization, do you see tools, do you see strategies that decrease polarization? Can you give us some hope here in terms of this trend?
Yeah, let me think about it. But first, I find it very interesting that you brought up this issue of, or through your work, of how you can influence civilians, also in times of war. And it's actually a topic that the military organizations in the West, but also elsewhere, but are becoming increasingly interested in. Also because they're trying to find out ways to diminish or decrease the number of casualties that may fall in war. And use as little force as possible, but then find other ways to motivate behavior. So we see that now there's like, especially with information and images becoming more and more powerful and important in war, you see that militaries are trying to find ways of using flyers and other methods, like organizations like Red Cross as well. For example, the Dutch armed forces in Mali a couple of years ago, they used pamphlets on the street to make sure that people would report on mines better, on road bombs. So those are influencing ways that also the militaries are increasingly trying to use. Back to polarization, I think I'm myself not a polarization expert, but I think there is a lot of work to be done and a lot of also good initiatives. I think it is increasingly important. I'm also quite happy that the topic is becoming more and more a priority. But to be very frank, specific methods to decrease polarization is not my question to address.
Yeah, that's fair. I understand. So I wanted to, you mentioned something that I asked the audience at the beginning, turn to the person next to you and say, what are the things you hope are covered or what are your expectations? And personally, what I wrote down is climate, and I'm really glad, Lotja, that you mentioned it as one of the trends, that you can see conflict stemming from climate change. And I want to go to Jan and ask, do you think that the international law frameworks are keeping up on conflict driven by climate change? Are we evolving fast enough on this regard?
Can you repeat the question again?
How is international law evolving to specifically to be able to handle and assess conflicts stemming from climate change. Are we keeping up well enough?
I think we're just stepping outside of the boundaries of international humanitarian law. So in the most general sense, related to international law, I cannot answer your question, but I don't think so. I don't think there's enough done. In terms of international humanitarian law, there are concerns about the environment. The trigger of climate change, of armed conflict, is again something that's not being addressed by international humanitarian law. As I was saying, that why states or non-state parties go to war is happening in the phase before there is an armed conflict, and therefore international humanitarian law is not applicable yet. But there are concerns about the environment in international humanitarian law, particularly in relation to
But there's such an interesting theme brought up by Lotje that I wanted to make sure that we try and tackle it as well. But it's also really important to hear from you. So we're going to try a new format here that we planned for a long time, literally minutes. This is going to be great. Here's what I want to do. I would love to hear from every single person here on what surprised you, or what are we missing, or I wish that really loud moderator would ask this question. But we don't have the time. So what I want you to do is to form this two-person panel with yourself and the person next to you, where you share either something that surprised you, something that you learned, or something you think we're missing here in this discussion. One of those three things: something that surprised you, something you learned, or something you think is missing. I'm going to give you just 2 minutes to mention it to your neighbor, and then we'll switch and you mention it back. Now wait, here's the key. Once you're done, I'm going to call on you to see what you learned from your neighbor, okay? You're not going to share what your thoughts are, but I want to hear what your neighbor has to say through your mouth. Okay, good. So, one thing that surprised you, one thing you learned, or one thing we left out? You guys, three, you got it. I must remain
but that's actually
Yeah, but then talk has specific focus. I cannot also go out of that. I'd be like how because we're waiting until
Okay, let's and really deep conversations, the ones that last longest and the best. All right, they all end pretty quickly. They can in that grade. All right, no, thank you. Good to come back. Okay, so I'm interested. What did you hear from your neighbor? I'm interested to hear your perspectives as well. But did somebody hear something surprising from the person next to them? Yeah, in the front. Sorry, when you see, there's going to be a mic coming to you. This is actually also for the people online. If we don't speak into the mic, it's unlikely that they hear us. So, go ahead.
It was very, very surprising what I heard from my neighbour. My mind had never gone there. His views was curious about how international humanitarian law could apply to, for example, a engineered person. For example, he referenced a genetically modified baby that was born, and so we're really going into the future law. But actually, my neighbour didn't think it was so far in the future.
Genetically engineered human beings and how international humanitarian law might apply to them. That's interesting. Did you come prepared to talk about that?
Very Captain America.
Dare I? I may have given you the two various topics of the day.
No, that's all right. This is specifically not covered yet under international humanitarian law, but it was also what you mentioned in terms of the development of new technologies. We always need to think ahead to see what's the future bringing, and sometimes it's like here, we just spoke about the use of drones in our conflict, and we always need to think about how do we apply the personal applicability of international humanitarian law to a situation. In terms of the use of autonomous weapons, such as drones, how can we ensure that there is still a form of responsibility when it comes to the usages of that? Engineered persons, we need to look at that. But in general, individually, you are responsible for upholding the principles of international humanitarian law. So if an engineered person is deployed to fight an armed conflict, then they would have to maintain their obligations under international humanitarian law just as much as a non-engineered person would.
That is something I didn't expect to hear today, but I'm glad you brought it up. It's a really interesting one. Who else was surprised by something their neighbor pulled away? Then right to the front again. You have both surprised each other, and this is good.
There was also with the climate change, as we talked about a few minutes ago, and it was regarding how many people would actually migrate. And so for me, simple logic, people don't have food, they migrate to places where there is food. But traveling takes money, it takes time, but especially the money. And what my neighbor brought up was basically that most of the people who would be migrating are farmers right now, and climate change is slowly taking away the money that they're making, so it's harder and harder for them to migrate in the end. And I never thought about it that way either, so that surprised me.
Yeah, me neither. That's a great question maybe to ask Lotje. When you talk about this 212 million, and I know you weren't looking at your notes at that moment, so we won't hold you to the number, but I had also thought, like, climate refugees, this means the shores are coming in, the sea is rising, and they have to leave coastal communities, but there's also the comment about essentially climate change creating economic refugees again. Do you have an idea on the balance of where they might be displaced because of rising sea levels versus economic migrants? what do you think will be the main driver of this climate change migration?
I mean, it's true. I didn't mention it, but a very important part of climate change-induced conflict is that it's not distributed equally. And even though global warming affects all of us, we definitely see that regions that are already more vulnerable today are more at risk in the future. We see, especially, for example, in the Middle East, but also in Sub-Saharan Africa, we see the risk of rising temperatures, especially high and climate change-induced scarcity. And indeed, what you mentioned as well, we expect, or it is expected, that climate change-induced migration will especially lead to urbanization. And we already see very crowded, growing cities. There's also a big aspect, well, according to Future War, that involves urban conflict, which is way more problematic to fight. So it also has, again, implications for military organizations. But I think it's a very valid point, and we do indeed see that the effects, also because governments in poorer and in more vulnerable countries will be less equipped to deal with the changes. Yeah, that's a very valid point. Thank you for mentioning it.
So I didn't see too many people raising their hands to say what their neighbor was saying. Yes, one here?
Yeah, I actually, what my neighbor said, I think it goes to the core of many other things. And it's what we are overlooking, that it's about the nature of information itself and truth. Because sometimes by looking, we also don't know if it's true or not. So it's so difficult today. I think that's what Washington says that. If you see the news, you are misinformed. If you don't see it, you're misinformed. So the nature of truth and how can you know what we're seeing, it's so important because we are generating also for polarizations, for everything that we are discussing here. There's also this element of truth, climate change. What are the narratives? What are the real impacts? So what is the truth and how can we do know this is what my neighbor thought that we kind of potentially left out of this conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad you've raised it. I think it's a brilliant point, and it speaks to, I think, all three of you. Ruslana, I see you going for the microphone. Go ahead. What do you think?
The most important thing, I think, is you need to check all information that you got, at least in 3 sources. Because when you read something, you remember something, and you think that it's true. But when a few people does the same thing, even if it's fake, 4 people and 5 people starting believe that it's true, and it's like covered true under a lot of fakes, and in the same moment, fake became true because more people believe in this thing, and it is dangerous.
Yeah. And Lotte or Jan, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so what you're saying is totally valid, that people should check their sources and go to multiple. The thing is, that's not what's happening today, and I think social media plays an enormous role in that. That the pace of information is so much faster. Indeed, what you mentioned just in the break, that influencing and images in warfare have always played a role, all the way back to the Peloponnesian War. But today, the rapid technological environment, like the rapid changes in information and communications technology, make that information is just, you're constantly exposed, especially those stories that are perhaps untrue or very much untrue, and also deliberately untrue. They really target these cognitive biases in humans that make them react so quickly and intuitively to information, and then spread it, and then it spreads, and it snowballs. So yeah, I completely agree, but that's also part of the future of warfare, but that's so hard to control.
Deepfakes. I see a human, I see that someone is talking something, and I believe because I see alive. And it's more and more harder to understand what is behind of me, or what is in front of me.
Yeah.
What do I see really?
Yeah.
because technologies are developing and they are growing up, but it's also it's dangerous because if it is in hands of bad guys, they will use it.
Yeah, I think the ability to believe facts or the ability to agree on truth is so fundamentally at the core underneath all of the work that you're doing and probably all the work we're all doing. So I'm really glad you raised it. Thank you. And that's a really important point. Anybody else? Yeah, we have, okay, well now there's a group of 3 up here that I want to hear from. So what was surprising coming out of this group here? Oh, sorry, no, you've been cancelled.
We noted that the comics actually made it a lot easier to digest the information because there's so many shocking images that come out of war that often the anxiety and the stress can make it difficult to look at and to really disseminate the information from what you're seeing. And actually the comics we thought were very powerful in portraying the messages without evoking the same level of sort of emotional response that makes you want to look away, and it actually encourages you to think about the story and think about what you're seeing. And we thought that was interesting to see.
You've got a thumbs up from the crowd. I agree. Yeah, really fascinating point. Thank you. We can now return to our previously cancelled list over here.
Yeah, to add to the previous question, I wanted to involve Jan Tijmen because I think it's a good question for him. With the changing nature of warfare and the use of disinformation, misinformation, and since it's so intertwined in daily life and social media, for example, do you think it's possible to create policies to combat that without limiting, for example, freedom of press or other freedoms to just scroll through social media, post whatever you want?
You get the easy ones today, right?
It's an easy question, yes. I don't think that within the framework of international humanitarian law there is a need to limit information that is coming from legitimate sources. I mean, that goes against the principles, to be fair. The fact that we're talking about information that spreads through social media and that then effectively everyone may or may forward, use in any way they want. That is something that this legal framework cannot control. Having said that, new technologies of warfare includes looking at the digital environment. So it does include a person that works for a state sending out information that tries to hamper military operations or tries to influence. So we do look at that, and there is a need to see if the current legal framework is sufficient.
Thanks for the question. Can I toss it open now? You don't have to speak on behalf of your neighbor, but is there anything that you wanted to say that's really pressing, or a question that you have that you feel like we've not discussed while we have them here? Yeah.
Hi, I guess that's partially maybe connected to the previous question, but a little bit more into hybrid warfare as well. Like, do we expect some sort of developments in the international law regulations on international level to happen? As I would assume right now it's still sort of a Wild West also in terms of attribution and whatnot.
Is that self-explanatory for you? I'm lost, but I'm not educated. I'm just
looking at trends in conversation in terms of trends and how
maybe you can explain a little bit about what you mean on hybrid warfare. That's what throws me off, but maybe there are folks in the audience who are wondering the same thing.
Sure. By hybrid warfare, I mean the cyber warfare, the informational warfare, so cyber attacks. And also my friends were like, what do you mean by attribution? I mean, in terms of the attacker as well, potentially.
Okay. So let's focus on the cyber attacks, Helen, perhaps.
Yes, so again, these are new technologies that we're observing. There is no specific treaty law addressing this issue, but it's not to say that the principles of international humanitarian laws do not apply to such situations. So when there is person X working for a government Y using cyberspace to shut down the electricity grids in a city, that then leads to a hospital not being able to function anymore, and that very much will count towards an act of war, particularly if it is in the context of when it is in the context of an armed conflict. In terms of attribution, that's a more difficult question. Also because then we're stepping out of the boundaries of international humanitarian law, but I think that there's definitely a valid point that you're raising and which should be addressed.
Thanks, Jan. And thanks for your questions. I think these are really interesting topics that you've all brought up, which is why I'm really glad that you had the chance to discuss them a little bit with each other. I hope that a lot of you have come away with something surprising or something interesting from the person next to you. And I'm so glad that you've been here, Jan, Matja, and Ruslana, to weigh in on these topics, to provide your expertise, your passion, all of this research and this knowledge that you've accumulated over the years. It's been really great to hear it and share it with everybody. So that should wrap up this HagueTalks event. I'm really glad that you've all been here. I'm happy to announce the next HagueTalks event on the 30th of May. This topic will be overcoming challenges in reporting justice. So I think also very thematically relevant to what we could discuss today. So hope to see you all there. And also look out for the HagueTalks podcast, where the youth board team, right, am I correct, will dive deeper into the personal stories of interesting speakers, such as the ones who joined us today. So this guy's name is Alex. You can ask him about the podcast and where to find it, because I don't know the exact name. What is it, Alex? The HagueTalks podcast.
We're still working out, but we'll get it published.
Okay, soon to come. Forthcoming podcast, only you know about it. This was an exclusive announcement. So once again, a big thanks to Jan, to Matja, to Ruslana, and to you for coming to the HagueTalks. Thank you so much.